Hi, I'm Michael Matthews. I'm the Improv GM. So you've been adventuring in the dungeon for quite some time. You come up into a part of the cavern that's between you and the final destination, the final thing that you need. And there's a trio of ogres there. And they're hanging out around a campfire. They are picking their teeth with the bones of a dwarf that they've recently killed and skewered on a spit and eaten. There are a few other people who are tied up, who have been captured over against one of the walls in a very crude cage that they've created. And the GM looks at you and is like, "What do you do?" And one of the guys like, "I fire an arrow and I hit that dude right square in his eye to kill one of the ogres." And he goes for his dice, and the GM goes, "No, wait. Let's just role play it out. Put down the dice. We'll just talk it through." A lot of people aren't going to be terribly happy with that because they're used to picking up dice. Dice are cool. Like, you like the way that they feel. It gives a certain amount of tension. Like, you don't know what's going to happen in the combat. And it makes it so it's not just like GM fiat. So shouldn't we be using the dice in combat? That's frankly what most of the book is about. The game we sign up to play, if it's like D&D, there's a lot of combat. We expect there to be more to the combat than simply talking it out, because there's other factors involved. But when it comes to social conflict, we want to ignore all those things. We want it to just be about the things I say, the things that you say, and how the GM decides to interpret that conflict. And this is why I'm a very big fan of good systems that actually work in social conflict as a dice mechanic. And that, for a lot of people, is problematic. And we're talking a little bit about why. So this is going to be a little more complicated and split at first into a theory about why I think mechanical social conflict is a great thing in role-playing games, and then there'll be an example as a second video. There's a decent chance I might revisit this at some point, because this has been brewing for a while, and I've done 3 different attempts at this, and I think this one, at least for the time, says a lot of what I want, but it's one of those things that I want to get something up because it's been busy with the school year, so I have not gotten as much up there and going, and this is something I think more people should be aware of. So we're going to start off with, number 1, problems with social combat in an RPG, character agency. You ask people about why not to use social conflict. In a game, one of the big things you hear is it takes away agency. It's like, I can't fight the way my character can. I can't cast spells in real life that you know of. Wink. I also can't scale walls or pick locks, but I can talk. So I should be able to do that here without you just rolling dice to make things happen. And it feels like if you go to dice, that it's somehow taking away your ability to make decisions, which is kind of what agency is about. But here's the thing. Combat can take away your ability to make decisions. Death eliminates your agency, unless you're waiting to get resurrected or something. But you can't make decisions when you're dead, generally speaking. What I've discovered is it's not unusual to find someone who will not only accept death as legitimate consequences of combat, but they'll also insist that the story lacks consequences or tension if it is taken away. It's also not unusual for that same person to feel that social conflict turning to the dice violates their agency. But why? There's this thought that social combat is just about like literal mind control. Like, you're a diehard Star Wars fan who hates Star Trek, and I'm going to roll persuade skill because I've got a +5. I'm going to flip that, and you're going to be somebody else. That's not what a good social combat system does. We have a lot of them that are essentially like a single die roll, which is not granular at all. It doesn't give shades of consequences. It's just like a win or lose. It becomes this binary. A good social combat is about having a mechanical consequence for an argument or a battle of wills such that they actually matter mechanically to the game. It's not about changing who your character is at a base level and forcing them to do something they don't want to do. As a matter of fact, the examples I'll be talking about later specifically don't make you do something. You just take consequences if you end up losing. If you're in a combat, you go through a series of battles, your hit points is going to be lower, you're going to have less equipment or skill points or spell points or whatever it is you have in the particular system you're playing, and we know and expect this out of an RPG. There's a lot of role-playing games that are counting on a certain number of combat encounters specifically so that you're not full power when you get to whatever the ending thing is going to be. But we don't expect that your character would have butted heads with someone and come out of it more pissed off or exhausted because of it. But this happens in life literally all the time. And I don't mean that in the literally. You mean literally? Like, I do mean literally. Like, all the time in the world, someone is pissed off at somebody else because they've had an argument and one of them is losing. I'm a high school teacher, and my students can tell that the class before mine was a pain in the butt because it changes how I am in the next one. I try not to let it be, and sometimes a little bit of time I'll calm down and be okay. But sometimes you have a semester with hell classes, and it affects every facet of your life. You become frustrated from having to struggle with difficult personalities. It's not something you can leave at the door. Like, we're not punching each other, but I'm getting depleted. I'm losing patience. I am losing my ability to deal at times when I have classes or individuals like this. It's having an effect on me that makes the rest of the day harder. We just had parent-teacher conferences, and there were some students I had to tell, I wish you were in this class in a different section or in a different semester. Because the things that we do in here that are kind of cool, we can't do with who we've got. Because it's one of those fights that it's just not worth it. Trying to get someone who's clearly decided they don't want to do something to try to be involved and do it with it just disruptive, it becomes a gigantic problem. So I alter what we're doing in some of my classes around the makeup of those classes. And you know what? In real life, it's aggravating and it sucks, but in an RPG, I want those mechanics for one simple reason. Consequences that come about because of social conflict are much more interesting and varied to me than what can happen in combat. The reason we see so much combat in video games is it's a simple form of conflict, and it often comes down to a binary. Do we defeat our opposition, for whatever defeat means in this case, or did we lose? And that's not hard to program. I mean, I know programming's hard, but it's not terribly hard to have, like, this person dies or they don't. We still don't have too many good or particularly deep social choices in video games. We've got some with really good writing, but it quickly becomes this nightmare of branching paths if you want the consequences to have meaning. So they'll sometimes choose these 2 or 3. Like, you look at some of the Telltale games, there are a couple things each episode that matter, but they can't branch off into things that they haven't prepared for. They're still stuck on, you're on a railroad. We're going to alter that railroad a tiny bit depending on a few of these decisions, but it doesn't have the freedom that we have in either life or a tabletop role-playing game. To me, this is the much more interesting things tabletop games can do that can't be replicated well by computer games. They just don't work well. I can play Dragon Age or Divinity Original Sin and get really cool tactical combat that doesn't take 4 hours. I can explore a world in Skyrim or Fallout and see cool and interesting things. I can sit and look at a sunset in The Witcher 3, which I've done, because it's beautiful. In a role-playing game, I can have it described to me, and it's not going to be quite the same. Now, there are a few games with pretty well-written dialogue, but even those stick onto a path where I usually have, like, 4 choices. Even Age of Decadence, which is a fantastic fantasy game where you can actually get through all of it without ever getting into combat, probably because combat's super hard unless that's specifically what you do, because they want it to be like, people don't fight in real life all that much as individuals. So most people aren't. But even with the really good writing there's still the limited amount of choices, which they sometimes open up, but there's times when it's just unclear, because I'm not quite understanding what the author meant when they said it, so I'll make a choice, which is not the choice I would make if I could ask more questions. So yeah, social combat is more complicated than combat. There's a lot more variables, but part of the problem is none of those variables are actually at the table. You're at the table, sitting with friends, or even online with strangers. You don't have the pressure of that character's world on you. You're not looking up at someone who towers above you and has hated your countrymen since time immemorial. You don't have the aggravation of having just arrived at the city gates in the middle of a snowstorm. You're not hungry. You're not stressed. You're not a million different things your character is. And if you have dice as a part of it, it makes it more real. In combat, there's nothing to stop you from RPing it out, like I mentioned earlier. You could just talk it over. You don't need the rules, abilities, or dice. And we even do that sometimes. If you're a 20th level fighter and a 6-year-old or a single goblin rushes up to attack you, you're going to make the guy roll the dice because they're not winning. As a matter of fact, they're not probably doing anything that's going to matter. much. So why pick up the dice? If you're Captain America and you've got the Beyonder in the room, and I don't know if things have changed since last time I read something with a Beyonder in it, which was like the 1980s. But the Beyonder is like literally a sentient universe who's come to Earth and become like a god with an 80s perm. It's like a member of Air Supply became God. Now, Captain America can throw his shield, but it's not going to do anything. Stiltman is not going to affect the Silver Surfer. So if he tries, we have probably a funny little moment of seeing the Silver Surfer be like, come on, really? And then do whatever he wants to Stiltman, because let's be honest, there's nothing you can do. You know how it's going to turn out. One person's going to lose, and that person should react accordingly after they try. And if one of you gets pissy about pulling out the dice, think you should pull out the dice and do this, the person's kind of being a dick. Because let's be honest, the Beyonder's not going to be affected by Captain America's shield. A high school wrestler is not going to take down Captain America. A 6-year-old is not going to give your 20th level fighter a problem. It becomes flavor. So one person realizes they're not going to win. And so they role play that accordingly. Now, we do this in social combat all the time. And a lot of times what happens is you either argue until the player decides they give up or the GM decides they've succeeded. It's GM fiat. It's you've succeeded because the GM has decided we've argued enough, or that kind of makes sense. And it lacks the tension of the actual, is it going to work that the dice bring in? Because the dice means you can't browbeat your GM until it works. You're going up against someone else in that same world with those same pressures who might be towering above you and terrifying, who's not afraid of you. Or it might be someone who is scared of you, or who has a thing for you, or whatever it is. So with a GM fiat, it lacks tension. Like in Improv, we play status games quite a bit. It's great for an exercise because we have to consider them in a scene. At some point, someone has to give up status or it just stops working. If one person's always in charge and is never challenged, the scenes are going to become kind of samey pretty quick. We have to do something to switch it up. And at one point, there's this unspoken agreement that one of your characters is going to lose. And it's fun to play out, and it's cool to be in the moment, but there's never stakes. The stakes might be, is there going to be a good performance out of this? But those stakes always exist when you're doing improv in front of an audience, but your character loses because that's the most interesting thing to happen. That's what you're going for. If it doesn't work, the scene gets an edit and the next scene begins, but you don't have the white knuckle tension that can happen when two people are actually arguing because there's no danger there. Now, you put a Saturday Night Live scout in the audience while you're performing, suddenly you winning or losing is super important. And it probably stops being a funny scene and becomes kind of uncomfortable as you are trying to overcome each other to be the one who's actually taking over. And as a matter of fact, if you want to see what this looks like, Don't Think Twice by Mike Birbiglia, which was amazing and about improvisers, has exactly that scene. And it's, you see people not only jockeying for control, but you see the consequences that come up because of it afterwards, and it's great. Suddenly, if that SNL scout is there, the stakes aren't just like in character for what you're doing. They become real. It becomes tense in a way that a regular performance is not going to be. That's what the dice do with social combat. They make the scene have a real tension in the same way combat does. Another problem people bring up with social combat or conflict is it kills role-playing, and that's not true if you have a good system. Now, for my purposes, I'm expressly highlighting the social conflict systems in Dogs in the Vineyard and Smallville. Like, I've read Burning Wheel, but I haven't actually used it, and it looks like it totally fits, but I don't have my experience with how it plays. Tech Noir does some cool things, but it's a different beast in some respects. So I'm going to concentrate on particularly those two. If you've got some other ones that you can think of that really work well, throw them in the comments. I'd love to take a look because I like systems like this. A good social combat system actually highlights aspects of your character instead of being just you going to the dice. In Dogs in the Vineyard, where you're essentially Mormon paladins going around from place to place, solving the problems that have happened because of incorrect worship and evil and selfishness in these towns. It's like the Incredible Hulk meets Little House on the Prairie meets the Salem Witch Trials. Something like that. So if you rolling your gruff bastard dice, you're not being kind when you drop the truth on this person. You can't just be like, I'm rolling my gruff bastard. I'm like, thank you, ma'am. Happy to see you. Very glad we could be here today. Might we have some tea? No, that's not your gruff bastard. You're playing a gruff bastard. If you roll those dice, that means that's who you're being. That's who you are. You chose that as your character. You shouldn't be being nice right now. Now, in Smallville, you roll your values, your relationships, and distinctions. Essentially, why you're doing something, who you're doing it for, and then like a distinction is essentially what is something about you that makes you particularly good or bad at this. Think distinctions, kind of think aspects and fate, sort of. But they inform your role playing, and does it slow things down? Maybe a little. So if we're doing Dogs in the Vineyard, it's just pretty quick because you decide what you're doing. You make a big roll of dice, and then you kind of set stuff up to begin the conflict. And like one person will set out 2 dice to begin. Like this is my, it's like poker. This is my stake. I put out an 11, and then they role play. And the other guy basically puts it out to meet, and then raises it up with 2 more dice. You hopefully they're trying to meet with 1 or 2 dice. So it might be if the one person comes in and does their thing. If I'm the next one, I might give my dice it's going to meet and go, if you hadn't rushed in half cocked, they wouldn't have known what we're going to do. And then I'll grab my dice to raise it. This is why you're going to shut up and listen instead of thinking you know shit. I picked them out beforehand. Probably all this stuff is going on. I know these are the dice I want to use. I've been listening. I'm role playing. Just boom and boom. In Smallville, you're often rolling the same dice and just picking the highest 2, so that the dice pool keeps the same unless you change your tactics. Which, by the way, is what good writers and actors do. Good social conflict tends to keep tense character interaction from getting bogged down in pointless back and forth where nothing's happening. It makes it more tense and streamlined and makes it more in character. Your favorite writing is probably not people wandering all over the place for 15 minutes like we often do in real life. It takes some getting used to, but I mean, see my video on immersion. The amount of things people put up with that should kill immersion is huge. Role-playing games aren't good at it. So this is something that once you've internalized it, which for a good system doesn't usually take too long, because usually it's how they treat every conflict, it goes quick. Now, it helps refine what's important to the character. It gives them a stronger voice. And you only really use it when it comes down to super important things. So why they work? A good social conflict system might knock you out of a particular conflict in the same way combat would, but you get to decide what that means a lot of times. Do you storm off? Do you sulk? Do you shut down? You either take like consequences, like stress in Smallville. You can get knocked out, essentially. You can get taken out of a conflict, which means someone's essentially kicked your ass so hard with what they're doing that you either have to start a new conflict where they either knock you out completely, which means you're not able to roll dice anymore. You might still be there, but you kind of lost your ability to affect what's happening in that particular scene. You lost. You got shut down. And that happens in life. In Dogs in the Vineyard, you get fallout after a conflict, and you can start up new ones, but there's other things now a part of you that will make that another one a little more difficult. So it's not about mind control. It's about piling on the emotional or social consequences so that someone has won an argument and there's a mechanical effect left behind. It gives the butting of heads heft and importance. It means when a battle of will happens, it's a battle of will, and people don't just go off the same as they were before. This is why you don't use it for everything. If you ask John to get you a glass of beer and he doesn't feel like it doesn't become a social conflict unless you decide to try to enforce your will. This is the parent, like, in my house, under my rules, you're going to get me a beer. This is when, as a teacher, you ask someone, hey, can you put the laptop away? And if they're like, no, then it becomes a conflict. It's like, excuse me, grab your laptop, put it back in the cart, make sure you plug it in. And at that point, it starts to become something that it gets the attention of the class. If you just ask someone to put the laptop away, no one pays that much attention because they just get up and do it. It's when they say no that it's turned into a conflict and everyone is now aware of what's happening. Now, either of these, they might choose to flee the scene, they might choose to walk out of the classroom, but one or both of you are going to carry emotional consequences because of what happened. One of you is probably going to be angry. And here's the thing, stage plays are so bad at combat and action that it wouldn't exist as an art form if that's what we had to rely on as much as movies do. But there's a ton of films, and just about all stage plays are much more interested in the social dynamics of a character that build tension that way. And role-playing games don't do enough of that, I think, very often. It's something that is considered an advanced jamming technique mostly because it's not supported. And if it's a game that's supported, this stuff becomes pretty easy for people to grab a hold of. You see a not inconsiderate amount of it in things like Apocalypse World. That's got plenty. Or the Apocalypse World and the Powered by the Apocalypse will have plenty of things in there that are essentially a version of social conflict. I couldn't recommend a single die roll, and it's done for the same reasons that I couldn't recommend a single die roll of combat. It lacks tension. It lacks interest. It's anticlimactic. But I do recommend checking out Dogs in the Vineyard or Smallville or Burning Wheel, and I'm sure other role playing games other people might recommend. But it can make political and social webs of intrigue much more exciting. Vampire the Masquerade was gigantic in the 90s. I know I ran like a 3-year campaign of it, but it's a game that didn't do what it was supposed to be about. The social and political intrigues were huge, but it wasn't really supported by the system. It's the kind of thing where you had to ignore the game you were playing to use it. We used to go entire systems and someone would be like, "Hey, I didn't roll my dice once today." A better system would have made that interesting in a mechanical way. So I love social conflict if you have the right system. Please see the example. If you got any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you like it, go ahead, subscribe, and also share if this is something you think should get out there. I would love to hear what you all think, because I know this is something not a lot of people have good experiences with. They tend to think of like, oh, I roll diplomacy check in D&D or a persuasion roll, and then they feel they're kind of screwed over, which in those systems very often they're not wrong. But in a better system, social combat can help your character, can help your role play, and can add tension in places that has been left up to GM fiat before. I'm Michael Matthews. Thank you very much.